Hi, I'm Doug Woodward. I am very pleased to be here. This is the first time I've had a chance to be on a Prophecy Watchers show or in a conference, and so I'm really excited to be here today. So I appreciate the opportunity very much. All right, so some of you know a little bit about me, but many of you don't, and probably very few of you know what I've been doing the last 5 years. I was a professor of entrepreneurship, taking advantage of my experience at Microsoft and Oracle at a major university here in Oklahoma. I actually took the time, it took me about 3 years to get a master's in finance, and that's part of my day job now. I had been awarded also an honorary master's in theology for all of the books that I've written in the past. Speaking of which, over the past 5 years, I've written 8 books, and I'm now up to about 20 books. So my goal is generally to write 2 a year, and that's worked out pretty well for me so far. I also, my day job, I am a chief financial officer for various companies, and that's usually quite fun and interesting. And I've also built a very significant website with a large web store, become a little bit of a publisher. Faith Happens Books and faithhappens.com is the website. And I also created a marketing logo about 5 years ago, which I'll let you be the judge. This is what the guy came up with, and I decided I'd go with that for a while. But some of you will think, well, no, he's making light of a very serious subject. And that's true, I am. And so I'm very hopeful that nuclear clown does not make an appearance in the United States in the years ahead. But serious things may happen to our country, and that's what I'm here today to talk about. The emphasis during this time, books I've written relatively recently, I wrote a book on cosmology with a number of other brothers called Revising Reality. We did a DVD on CERN, which if you haven't seen it, it'll blow your mind. So you can get that from me at my website. I wrote a book with Gary Hoffman on the rapture and what happens right after the rapture and what happens in the interim period of time between the rapture and the actual literal second coming. I am still premillennial. I am still pre-trib, despite the fact that I have a lot of friends that have tried to pull me in different directions. Additionally, in the last 2 years, I have done extensive work on the Bible, specifically on the Septuagint. Rebooting the Bible in part 1 is focused on a 1900-year-old conspiracy of the descendants of the Pharisees, I'll just say it that way, and how they obscured the messianic prophecies in the Bible and also changed the chronology of Genesis 5 and 11 to make it more difficult to give evidence for Jesus as the Messiah. In Rebooting the Bible Part 2, I talk about the chronology. The Septuagint chronology adds 1,500 years to the chronology of Genesis 5 and 11, and it actually influences how we understand the stories of the Old Testament. So that's what I talk about in Part 2. The middle book I wrote in between, and that's a book called A Biography of the Christian Bible, and it really deals with the transmission of the Bible, how we got our Bible today, and how we defend that Bible in the 21st century, thank you. All right, today I'm going to be speaking, this will be where I use my prop. The newest book I've just written is called American Requiem, Does the USA or Why the USA Falls in the Last Days. And it also ties in some additional information from books I've written, Mistaken Identity, which is the case against the Islamic Antichrist, which I believe today almost 50% of you folks who study Bible prophecy have decided that the Antichrist is a Muslim, and I don't necessarily agree. But nevertheless, I talk about that in that book, Mistaken Identity. The full scenario of what I'm going to talk about, the Gog and Magog War, I'll get to that later, that is discussed in the book, The Next Great War in the Middle East. And again, these books have been written at different times over the past 5 years. American Requiem is brand new. Okay, so getting a little closer to teeing up what we're going to talk about today and to point something out. I have been for 7 years, probably, I don't think I'm bragging to say I'm probably the leading spokesperson for the position that America plays one of the roles of Babylon in the last days. Wrote a book with two guys, Doug Krieger and Dean McGriff, The Final Babylon, which was a bestseller. And I've modified my position a little bit from that, but not a whole lot from that. And then prior to that, I'd written two books called Power Quest, which really dig into the association of the Antichrist with America. So I'm kind of the culprit when it comes to the view that America may be one of the Babylons, as we'll talk. I'm not alone, though. There are a lot of voices that have argued the same. John Price, who wrote a foreword for one of my books, Patrick Heron, a good brother, Irish brother, a fellow named J.R. Church, who wrote a book called Guardians of the Grail, in which he talks about the possibility that the USA fulfills some of the Babylonian prophecies. A fellow named R.A. Coombs, who did extensive work. I think he developed a book finally that said 70 Reasons Why the USA is Babylon. Dr. Stanley Monteith did a very extensive study called Brotherhood of Darkness, which you may have read, but it deals with the Illuminists and the Illuminati and their influence, the Masonic influence in the United States. And then a brother, Noah Hutchings, that of course founded and ran the Southwest Radio Church for a long time. And then preceding him, a guy named Frank Logston, who was actually the pastor at the Moody Church. Now, I knew all of these folks and had a chance to work with some of them, except for Coombs and Logston. So I've exchanged lots of ideas and have kind of tended to confirm my opinion. So I would just say here that when it comes to looking at the future of America, that even Ben knows that we're kind of in trouble. So right now, I'm going to shift and talk about three books that are really from secular experts that have come to the conclusion that we are on the precipice. We are at the edge of collapse. And these are more sort of macro level books that talk about the major reasons why this may be so. I'll talk about some more of the particular reasons a little bit later. But is the USA on the verge of a collapse? Yes, says Jared Diamond. Yes, says William Strauss and Neil Howell. And yes, says Chris Hedges. All right? So we'll take each in turn. Jared Diamond is a famous naturalist, degree in biology, I believe, but I used one of his books, Guns, Germs, and Steel, in teaching my entrepreneurial class on social entrepreneurship, it was called, and talked about the sort of the beginnings of civilization. Well, in this book, he deals with why civilizations collapse and talks about the factors that influence that. So I just get right to the point. Why do civilizations collapse? Well, first off, they may have destroyed their environment. If we talk in terms of the Easter Island or Iceland, the people cut down all the trees, and that really had some pretty big implications for them. So that would be an example of destroying the environment. Persistent climate change, not necessarily caused by mankind, because that would only have been in the last few years that we could hear the claim that we did that. But nevertheless, if we look at events in the history of the world, probably the mini ice age back in the 15th century, it had influences upon peoples and where they lived and where they moved and so forth. Another factor that can be influential in collapse is the synergy, symbiotic relationship with a fellow society or civilization. And for one reason or another, that society collapses and it causes your society to collapse. So that can be a factor as well. Certainly, the big one that we're all tuned into, hostile neighbors attack and destroy the society. We can think of the fall of Rome. We can think of the fall of Constantinople. We can even think in terms of some hostile neighbors that we might have. The world today, of course, we're all sort of neighbors. Every place on earth can be reached by a missile within less than half an hour. So hostilities can break out and influence the world within a very short span of time. In addition to that, political issues, internal issues that can destabilize the society. We have a few of those right now. All right, so he asks this question, is the United States collapsing? And he refers to a poem, Ozymandias, by Percy Bysshe Shelley. Most of you will probably know his wife's book more than you know about Percy Bysshe, and her name was Mary Shelley, and she wrote Frankenstein. Nevertheless, he talks about Ozymandias. Let me read the quote from Jared Diamond. He says, "The artifacts of an extinct society, especially their most significant monuments, testify to the former wealth and power of their builders. The boast, 'Look at my works, ye mighty, and despair,' which was in Percy Bysshe Shelley's Ozymandias, it reflects this. Yet the builders vanished, abandoning the great structures that they had created at such effort. And so how could a society that was once so mighty end up collapsing? Now, lurking behind this romantic mystery is the nagging thought, might such a fate eventually befall our own wealthy society? Will tourists someday stare mystified at the rustling hulks of New York's skyscrapers, much as we stare today at the jungle overgrown ruins of the Mayan cities?" Okay, the second expert or experts has to do with the fourth turning, William Strauss and Neil Howe. The fourth turning, you probably have heard of that book. There's this fellow named Steve Bannon, who was a political advisor to a guy named Donald Trump, and Bannon relied heavily upon the thinking in the fourth turning. And so I want to expose you a little bit to that today, because they also raise the question about whether or not we might be on the verge of collapse. First off, they begin their fairly long introduction to the book with what I call a stinging self-assessment. And I'll just read through this. "Neither an epic victory over communism nor an extended upswing of the business cycle can buoy our public spirit. We perceive no greatness in our leaders, a new meanness in ourselves. Not long ago, America was more than the sum of its parts. Now it is less. Popular trust in virtually every American institution, from businesses and governments to churches and newspapers, keeps falling to new lows. We perceive our civic challenge as some vast, insoluble Rubik's Cube." Now, specifically, what did they mean by four turnings? Well, essentially, they mean a life cycle of society, life cycle of civilizations. And they chart the four turnings as the following: high, awakening, unraveling, and crisis. The high turning is when a new society or society sort of resurrects itself and begins anew. It's an upbeat era. The institutions in that society strengthen. There really is a new civic order in a way that the population relates to one another, and the values of an older regime begin to fade away. In the awakening phase, it is a passionate era of spiritual upheaval. The old order is attacked by the values of the new order. In an unraveling, it tends to be a downcast era. Institutions weaken, old civic order begins to decay, and the new regime's values begin to implant in the way of thinking of that culture. And then finally, crisis, a decisive secular era, a regime with new values replacing the old order, and individualism reigns rather than institutions. And I bet you can guess what the fourth turning is and where we are in this life cycle. But let me walk you through at least my take on the life cycle of roughly 80 years or so. The life cycle in America is rather structured and tends to be an 80-year to a 100-year cycle. I chart the sort of upbeat era, the high era, from 1945 to 1971. So it was the victory in World War II, all the way to a downturn at Vietnam, and certainly a crisis point that was made public amongst the baby boomers we know as Woodstock, which was in 1968 or 1969, if memory serves. The awakening era, that spiritual upheaval, which kind of began at Woodstock, and it was the era of drugs, as we know. The pivot points here really were Watergate through the end of the Reagan administration, the Iran-Contra affair being kind of the key point there. The unraveling, the downcast era from 1990 to 2008, and again, there are different arguments for whether a particular era is or isn't actually the particular turning that they talk about, but I believe that upon study, which we don't have a lot of time to do today, that these are pretty accurate projections as to when these events occurred or when these eras took place. And this, I believe, is from Desert Storm to the Great Recession of 2008 and 9. And of course, 9/11 is in the middle of that as well. And so we could say that America began to unravel even as early as the last or the first Bush and through the Clinton years, which were stressful in various ways. And then obviously moving into the Great Recession, 9/11 and so forth. But they believe, they had predicted, they wrote the book in 1998, but they predicted sometime around 2005, we would shift over into the fourth turning, the crisis turning. I believe that crisis did begin at the end of the Great Recession, the downturn economically in the United States, and it will continue through major Mideast wars. We've already had, of course, some significant wars in the Middle East, but they're not done yet. And so, so the prediction that they make is that a fourth turning will last no more than 30 years, and it began sometime around 2005. So it would suggest that around 2029, 2030, the crisis may reach a maximum point. Now, a little bit more specific is a fellow named Chris Hedges. Chris actually went to Harvard Theology School, but he became a journalist primarily covering wars. So he was at Desert Storm, and he covered wars as a war correspondent for the New York Times. So he's very well educated and has a very strong opinion. In fact, I would say that he is probably one stop short of being a Marxist. So despite, he's not an atheist, but he is a Marxist in terms of his understanding of the way society should be structured. So his analysis, though, I would say we can learn a lot from his analysis. There's a lot of value in it. So I'm going to quote him and read this. The reign of capitalism would conclude, and this is really an assessment of what Marxism would say about capitalism and democracy. All right, so the reign of capitalism would conclude when it would prey upon, in the name of austerity, the working class and the poor, driving them ever deeper into debt and poverty. Now think about this in light of where are we today in America. Most of us are working class folks in middle America, most of us. So think about this as I'm reading along. So driving the poor even deeper into debt and poverty and diminishing the capacity of the state to serve the basic needs of ordinary citizens. It would, as it has, increasingly automate or relocate jobs, including both manufacturing and professional positions, to countries with cheap pools of laborers. This would trigger an economic assault not only on the working class, but on the middle class, the bulwark of a capitalist democracy that would be disguised by massive personal debt. I have a little bit too much of that myself. As incomes declined or remained stagnant and borrowing soared, politics would, in the late stages of capitalism, become subordinate to economics, leading to political parties that were hollowed out of any real political content, meaning the two parties really look like the same party, and abjectly subservient to the dictates of corporations. And again, this is one of the major things that we see. If you wonder, is the government of the people, or is it the government of the corporations? The people have very little influence on Congress, but lobbyists representing corporations have a great deal of influence, and they seem to do very well. All right, so character flaws at the time of collapse. Hedges cites another scholar, Eric Vogelin, and I think this also is a characteristic of where we are. He says, the idiots take over in the final days of a crumbling civilization. Idiot generals wage endless, unwinnable wars that bankrupt the nation. Idiot economists call for reducing taxes for corporations and the rich and cutting social service programs for the poor. Idiot industrialists poison the water, the soil, and the air, slash jobs, and depress wages. Idiot bankers gamble on self-created financial bubbles. Idiot journalists and public intellectuals pretend despotism is democracy. Idiot intelligent operatives orchestrate the overthrow of foreign governments, and perhaps domestic, to create lawless enclaves that give rise to enraged fanatics. Hedges is a very direct, almost acerbic, very kind of angry person, and this is where he comes down. So we've really looked at three different points of view regarding why society could be on the verge of collapse. Now, is there a solution to that collapse? For Diamond, the solution is fundamentally just warning us, just making us aware that collapse is at the door. For Strauss and Howe, there is a little bit of a Pollyanna view that we should just trust in the cycles of life and civilizations, that the fourth turning will be a crisis, but at the end, there will be regeneration and rebirth. That may not be so true, unfortunately, this time. For Chris Hedges, a nonviolent revolution in social values, or his solution is we should basically go on strike. So he would not call for a violent revolution the way that a Marx or Lenin would, but he would say that we need to strike to force the government into making changes in its policies. But for Christians, how should we deal with the possibility of collapse? Well, to a great extent, this is how we're called to live all the time, to model the kingdom of God as best as we can until the king comes and establishes it over all the earth and rules the nations with a rod of iron. But we should be living salty lives, and we should occupy until he comes. As a quick little sidebar, I ran across this, I thought you'd find this interesting. Few know that salt and salary are actually related, the words. Word Central provides the monetary history for the word salt. Salt was a very valuable substance in ancient times. In addition to being used to flavor food, it was also used to keep foods from spoiling. Because of its importance, soldiers in the Roman army were given a special sum of money with which to buy salt for themselves. The Latin word for salt was sal, and the salt money was given to soldiers, and that was called salarium. Salarium later came to be used for the regular pension or salary paid to the soldiers. Still later, it was used for payments made to officials of the empire. And the English word salary comes from the Latin salarium, which is derived from salt. So it really is at the heart of how we solve some of the economic problems, is be valuable. We need to be valuable. We need to be salt. All right, so let me do, if I may, a little bit more detailed dive into the source of the potential disaster that we may be entering into. What might destroy our society? Is it from without or is it from within? First off, from within. It's very feasible that the dollar will collapse, possibly as early as 2021. A number of experts believe that within the next 3 years it will. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, has already called for, just in the last 2 weeks, Bretton Woods II. Bretton Woods I was in 1944 and established America as the go-to economic system that the world would model itself after. And in 1971, of course, the U.S. established the petrodollar. But they're calling for a new order. And essentially, you're hearing a lot now about the Great Reset. Well, that is to move the dollar away as the reserve currency of the world. And once that happens, that's going to have a big impact upon the United States. Surveillance has been significant. If you haven't seen the movie A Great American, I highly recommend it. It's a movie on William Binney, and it really tells the story of how surveillance has come to captivate our government and how it's come to oversee our lives. So I encourage you to watch that movie if you haven't already seen it. The U.S. Congress is frozen into inaction. Career politicians reign. It would be great if we could have term limits so that the politicians would have to serve the people rather than serving the lobbyists and serving the party hierarchy. But the way we are today, in my view, we have one political party, essentially the status quo. And that status quo needs to change, but we seem frozen in inaction. We're weakened by never-ending wars, continuous war. That seems to be the modus operandi of the United States. We live in a war economy, and that war economy is essentially built around the Boeings and the Lockheeds and those kinds of organizations. And small businesses are not the emphasis. You hear a lot of talk about how small business is the backbone of this country. That's really not true. Small businesses, due to what's happened over the last few months, has destroyed many small businesses. It may be many years before we get the small business back to where it should be. But the war economy continues. It survives. It thrives. Wall Street, I believe, is not, although our President Trump likes to use it as a measure of our health, it's not a measure of our health. That is Wall Street, it's not Main Street. Our largest cities now are threatened by chaos. Civil war seems inevitable. The police have become a public enemy. Law and order is now really on the brink. Now, from without, what are the challenges that we face? Well, China. The media tends to say that Russia is our enemy. The real enemy is China. I don't necessarily believe that China will bring war against us, although that may happen. But certainly what's happened lately is they've discovered how to get at us. We've shown that we are weak and can succumb to the little germs that infect our bodies. And as our dollar collapses, our power diminishes, all of a sudden we have to pay real money, and we can't just keep turning it out by the Federal Reserve. Our resources are spread thin. We can no longer police the world. Our Navy retains great power, as does our Air Force, but today Goliath faces asymmetric warfare, and so little guys, the terrorists, become David. Nuclear arsenals proliferate. Unfortunately, our enemies now have newer and better weapons than we do. Russia has superior nuclear weapons, and they also have much stronger missile defense. You've probably heard of the S-400 and its successor, which will soon be available, the S-500. These are very powerful defenses against any missiles that we might fire at them. The media and the Democrats, as I said, assert Russia's the enemy, China's the larger enemy. China soon may dictate terms in the South China Sea, and it's very possible that very soon now, Taiwan, Israel, Australia will face a world without America's military to defend them. So, is God judging us because we are the final Babylon? Perhaps. Many voices suggest that the USA is Babylon. I'm listing just 9 points here that are all from Jeremiah 50 and 51. As you read those chapters, though, notice that many, almost all of the attributes of the daughter of Babylon that's talked about in those two chapters cannot apply to Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. He was conquered by the Medes and the Persians and the Medes when the waters were lowered and the troops just came in. They basically took over Babylon without firing a shot, which is an anachronism. I could say without shooting an arrow. All right, so just to list real quickly the attributes. We are the hindermost of nations, in my view, last in the series, the hammer of the whole earth, the richest nation in the world, a mingled people. We are a melting pot, not a boiling pot, a melting pot. A nation that lives on many waters. We have really 3 oceans if you count the Gulf of Mexico. The nations flow unto him. They stream unto him. Well, that's really talking about the nations that stream into New York City, to the United Nations. And unlike Mecca and Islam, that in my view was never a golden cup in the Lord's hands, we are, and we were once, a golden cup in the Lord's hands. The people of God are told they should flee Babylon. And ultimately, Babylon, the daughter of Babylon, betrays the people of God. The United States, we have been warned. Jonathan Cahn has done, of course, a tremendous job in teaching us from Isaiah 9, 10 through 11 that we are warned, we have been warned, and if we do not repent, if we do not change our ways, our destruction will come just as it came to the northern kingdom, Israel. So, the USA, the daughter of Babylon. I'm going to address the fact that I believe that there are 3 Babylons in the end time. And so I first off just want to assert that I believe the USA is known as the daughter of Babylon in Bible prophecy. And you'll see it mentioned in these verses. I won't read all of them. You'll have time to perhaps stop the video and read the verses. Psalms 137, Isaiah 47 verse 5, Jeremiah 50, 42. I mentioned Jeremiah 50 and 51 before, and even Zecharia 2:7. So you see this phrase, the daughter of Babylon, throughout the prophets in the Old Testament, including the Psalms. Now, I argue that America plays a significant role as one of the Babylons of the last day. Of course, that's the position I take. There are others that take different positions. Bill Salas still believes and argues for the revived Roman Empire. In fact, I'll go ahead and show that. He still is sort of the Hal Lindsey scenario, the revived Roman Empire. And so Rome, but really the European Union that's transformed into a 10-nation confederacy, is the power base of the Antichrist in the last days. A fellow named Dave Hunt, the late Dave Hunt, wrote a book in 1994 called A Woman Rides the Beast. Tremendous book if you've never read it. And unfortunately, it exposes all of the horrific things that have been done by the Catholic Church in its weaker moments, especially to the Protestants. So I encourage it. But his view is that Mystery Babylon, at least, is Catholicism. And then Joel Richardson, who I count as a friend, he and I have debated on the subject of whether or not Islam is, in fact, the religion of the Antichrist. He argues that Mecca, the city of Mecca, is, in fact, the center of the Babylonian religion. All right, so we're going to get now deeper into an understanding of the fact that the Bible's presentation of what it means by Babylon, it is difficult. It is a mystery. As I say here in the last bullet point, is the greatest mysterion, the Greek word for mystery, in all the Bible. There are two things that are very difficult to understand. One is, who is the Antichrist going to be? That number 666, what does that tell us about the Antichrist? And the second thing is, where is Babylon? Who is Babylon? What is Babylon? Well, if you read, which I did, and I talk about this in my book, I studied, I think a dozen or so sort of old scholars over the last 400 years and read carefully through their analysis of what the Bible means by Babylon. And they say that Babylon is both a metaphor for human government, and it's really seen as the political realm that opposes God. All right, so it can be seen as just a metaphor, as a symbol, as a cipher. For 3 centuries, it was sometimes talked about as the world city, meaning that it was a city that represented the world, not just a particular city on the banks of the Euphrates and the Tigris, but that it really was representative of all cities, urban centers that typically are antithetical to the teaching of Judeo-Christian points of view. All right, Babylon, though, I believe has 3 literal fulfillments that coalesce in the last days, which I'll talk about. The daughter of Babylon, Mystery Babylon, and Babylon the Great. And these differences are discerned by understanding each of these entities' attributes, who destroys each Babylon, how they are destroyed, and when they are destroyed. To gain this understanding, one has to do extensive exegesis and a lot of research, which I did, and is in the book American Requiem. All right, and so to begin to delineate between these 3 Babylons, the daughter of Babylon is addressed more as a land than a city. It's an alliance of nations from the north destroys it through war, making its land desolate. All right, so you say, well, now, how would the United States be potentially destroyed from a nation to the north? Canada's not likely to send missiles our way. Of course not. However, if you look at North Korea, China, and Russia, they would all fire missiles at us, not over the Pacific, but over the North Pole. And so they would reach us much quicker that way. So if we were attacked by missiles, it would be from the north. Mystery Babylon is represented as a religion as well that is drunk with the blood of the saints. Who destroys it? The Antichrist and his alliance of 10 kings. They obliterate Mystery Babylon. They hate the whore and they destroy it. Now, Babylon the Great appears to be both a land and a city, and it appears to also be the world system. Who destroys it? The King of Kings. He destroys it at the very end, the culmination of this era, of this age. And afterwards, the scripture says that it lies desolate and is no longer inhabited. Now, I don't expect you to read this, but this is a table that I put together that shows the 3 Babylons that I believe, again, coalesce at the end times, scriptural references to each, their attributes. And there is definitely the possibility that you're going to see some of the attributes apply to the others. So there's not perfect consistency when we look at attributes. Again, the Bible uses hyperbole, it uses metaphor, but it also does intend that its prophecies be interpreted literally. But when we look at who destroys each of the Babylons and when that occurs and how they are destroyed, we can delineate them. I believe the U.S. is going to be destroyed at the time of the Battle of Gog and Magog, and I'll show in a moment that I'm not alone in that idea. A couple of books here. Douglas Berner wrote a great book in 2008, which I've studied and congratulated him on an outstanding volume. Terrific study on that. If you're interested in that, I highly recommend it. I co-wrote a book with Ben Baruch and J.R. Nyquist. J.R. is a very intelligent expert on Russia and weapons of mass destruction. And so I had a chance to write the foreword to that book, and I'm very pleased that I had that opportunity. All right, and so again, these verses talk about the alliance of nations from the north that come to destroy the daughter of Babylon. And it says here, I'll read one of the verses, because of the wrath of the Lord it shall not be inhabited, but it shall be wholly desolate. Everyone that goeth by Babylon shall be astonished and hiss at all her plagues. As God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah and the neighbor cities thereof, saith the Lord, so shall no man abide there, neither shall any son of man dwell there. A sound of battle is in the land, and of great destruction. So as you read these, you begin to see that these are distinctions from Mystery Babylon. These are distinctions from Babylon the Great that's talked about at the end of Revelation. And this one, I think, is dead on in terms of describing America. How is the hammer of the whole earth cut asunder and broken? How has Babylon become a desolation among the nations? So this does not predict a great future for our country, and for that we should all be sorrowful. So, am I the only person that has predicted this? No, not at all. Many of us that study Bible prophecy have predicted that sometime before Daniel's 70th week, the daughter of Babylon, or the battle of at the battle of Gog and Magog, will occur, and that will occur before the 7 years begins. So you have Arnold Fruchtenbaum, John Hagee, Grant Jeffrey, Tim LaHaye. You've heard a few of these names. Chuck Missler, Randall Price, the late Chuck Smith, myself. We all believe, and I'll show you another chart here in a moment, that this is going to happen just before the final 7 years begins. The chart on the right talks about when does Gog and Magog happen, and it lays out the different points of time when it could occur. The first one I show is during or at the end of the Great Tribulation. And so you have at or after the midpoint, Hal Lindsey, Noel Hutchings, Jack Van Impe, Dwight Pentecost. These are all important names, of course. Now, just prior to the midpoint, Salem Carbon, Mark Hitchcock, John Woolvard, Warren Worsby. The beginning of the 70th week, a fellow named J.R. Church, Peter Goodgame, Thomas McCall, Zola Levitt. You've heard a lot of these names, I'm sure. And then, as I've already showed and listed the names of those that believe that the Battle of Gog and Magog is where the daughter of Babylon is destroyed. Dispensationalists, we love charts. Ever since the time of Clarence Larkin, we've had charts. Well, this is my chart. And what I'm attempting to show here are the three Babylons and when each is destroyed. I align, you'll see the silhouette of the United States there on the far left. I believe the sixth seal is broken slightly before the 7 years begins. I believe that the great earthquake that's talked about in Ezekiel 38, in Revelation 6, in Haggai 2:6, and in Hebrews 12:26, that this is the same earthquake. And this is an incredible earthquake that impacts the entire world. And I believe this will happen. This is remember in Revelation 6, the great earthquake, and that men and women hide in caves and pray that the rocks will fall down on top of them to protect them from the wrath of God. I believe this happens, and this is the beginning point of the 7 years, perhaps as much as 3 years before. All right? Then at the midpoint of the 70th week, the Antichrist is revealed. The Antichrist has not been revealed in the first 3.5 years. So I have a different view of the seals than some. But it is the second Babylon, the time the second Babylon is destroyed. I have a picture of the Vatican here. This is Mystery Babylon, and it's destroyed by Antichrist and the 10 kings. Now, the Antichrist can't destroy Mystery Babylon until he's revealed, and he's revealed halfway through the 70th week. And that's why I show him being revealed and destroying Mystery Babylon just after that period of time. Finally, the conclusion at the end of the 7 trumpets and the 7 vials, Babylon the Great is destroyed by the King of Kings when he comes again to set up his kingdom. What's the picture here, you may wonder? Well, those of you that know a bit about finance will recognize that that's the city of London. It's very possible that although the United States may be destroyed, as I've talked about, the Anglo-American alliance, England, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth, it may persist. Even remnants of the American military may persist. It could be led by the head of the United Nations. It could be led by the King of England. All of these have been theorized. But I'm showing the City of London because it is an economic system that, combined with Wall Street, has been dominating the world for the last 120 years. And really, London and the British pound has been dominating the world for a lot longer than that. So the third Babylon, Babylon the Great, is destroyed. Hallelujah, hallelujah, the King of Kings is coming at last. And so, beginning to wrap up now with just a couple of more slides. I pulled this one in. This was a poem written by W.B. Yates in 1919. And the name of the poem is The Second Coming. I won't read the whole thing. I'll let you do that. But I'll read the conclusion. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born? The language is mystical, but he's certainly speaking of the Antichrist. And he is wondering if the second coming is happening in 1919. Well, what happened in 1919? The Spanish flu, the great epidemic that was far worse than the epidemic that we're in now. Yates lost his wife to the Spanish flu. And so for him, it was the second coming. It was the end of the world. Something to ponder. Let me conclude, though, first off with Ben Franklin's prayer. This was given at the Constitutional Convention. It was in 1787. This will take a second to read, but I think you'll appreciate it. In the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room for the divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. All of us who were engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. To that kind of providence we owe this happy opportunity of consulting in peace on the means of establishing our future national felicity. And have we now forgotten that powerful friend? Or do we imagine that we no longer need his assistance? I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings that, except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this. And I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel. We shall be divided by our little partial local interests. Our projects will be confounded, and we ourselves shall become a reproach and a byword down to the future age. That's a reference to Jeremiah 50 and 51. And what is worse, mankind may hereafter, from this unfortunate instance, despair of establishing governments by human wisdom and leave it to chance, war, and conquest. The American experiment, is the American experiment coming to an end? Is the last vestige of democracy, the Republican nature of our country, is this coming to a conclusion? It could be. Let me leave you with these thoughts from Jeremiah. There is hope. There's always hope for those of us that believe in the Lord Jesus Christ. I believe it's Peter that says his eyes search to and fro throughout the earth, looking for those and how he can bring salvation to them. In Lamentations, written by Jeremiah, as he was writing, of course, Nebuchadnezzar was bearing down on Judah, and Jeremiah had already been thrown in a well, up to his armpits in muck, but he was still hopeful. And I'm very touched by these words. The first words are from a great hymn, "Great is thy faithfulness." "This I recall to my mind, therefore have I hope. It is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, saith my soul. Therefore will I hope in him. The Lord is good unto them that wait for him, to the soul that seeketh him. It is good that a man should both hope and quietly wait for the salvation of the Lord." Amen. Thank you very much. God bless you.